Okay, hi everybody. In this video, I want to talk about the pivot wider function in the tidyr package in tidyverse. And this is what we use when we want to take one column in a data frame and split it up and spread it out into multiple columns. And the result of that operation is going to take a data frame, and obviously it's going to create more columns in the data frame and reduce the number of rows. And that's why we call it widening the data frame, because we have more columns. I guess we could call it shortening a data frame because it's also going to have fewer rows. And it works pretty similar to the pivot longer function that we saw earlier, in terms of the arguments that we enter into the function. So just recall the pivot longer function we applied to a table like table 4a, where we had two columns, 1999 and 2000, that for in this case were giving us tuberculosis cases, and we really wanted to combine those two columns into a single column and create an additional column for year, so that we had like two rows for Afghanistan 1999, Afghanistan 2000, and the tuberculosis cases, which were originally being stored in two different columns, were merged, and all of these tuberculosis cases were being stored into one column, that has length 6, right? So that we made the data frame longer. Here, we're going to do the exact opposite. So now let's consider like a case like table 2 that we're looking at. And here, the situation is looking at this data set, this data frame as it's initially stored. It seems like we have four variables: country, year, type, and count. But type is really not a variable at all. In fact, what we have here are the variables should really be country, year, cases, and population. So type and count, these are not really variables, but cases and population, they should be two different variables. So what I want to do is take the values that are being stored in this count column, in this one column count, and these should really be split up into two different columns. One column for tuberculosis cases, and half of these values should be stored in a separate column for population. So rather than have four rows for Afghanistan, I should just have two rows for Afghanistan, and each of those rows should have a column for cases and then a separate column for population. So we want to make the data frame wider. We want to add a column so that we have a column for cases and a column for population. And as a result of widening that data frame, we're going to reduce the number of rows that we need to represent all of the data. So that's what we call widening the data. So we're going to need to enter a couple of things in the pivot wider function. So the function to do this in tidyr is named pivot wider. And we're going to need to enter the names, the column from which the names of the new columns will be taken from. So in this case, the new columns, the names are going to be taken from the type column, for example. And then we need to indicate the values from the column from which the values that the new columns will be taken from, and that would be the count column. So the data that we're going to tidy up here is the data that is initially being stored in table 2. And we're going to get the names for our new variables from the column type. So that's what is going here. And we're going to get our values from the column that is called count. And over here, these are not being specified inside of double quotes. Notice. So this worked when I did not specify the names inside of double quotes. And the result here was a data frame that now had that one column that had, I think it was called count, that now got split into two different columns. So we made it wider. And as a result of that split, the data frame became shorter. We have less rows. And here I'm thinking that I don't think it matters whether we put these things inside of double quotes or not. Yeah, so I think that the code here, I had mentioned in an earlier video that we can put these titles, the column names in double quotes, but I doesn't matter whether we put the names in double quotes or not. The code works all just the same regardless. So whether or not I had the names in double quotes, the code produces the same exact output. Okay, so that is an example for how we can widen a data set. You can run $pivot wider. There are more customizable options that you could use inside of that function. I just wanted to give an example with a smaller data frame, but you can get really fancy with more customizable options. And how you apply this to larger data frames. But pretty much the two main operations that you're going to want to do when you're tidying a data frame are going to be lengthening the data frame, taking multiple columns and combining them into one column and adding more rows in order to do that, or widening a data frame by taking one column and splitting it up into multiple columns and thus shortening the data frame. And the first operation you do with pivot longer, the second operation you do with pivot wider. Okay, so that is a break on the tidyr package and how to tidy up your data. In the next video, I want to talk about how we could take data that is stored in two different data frames and merge it together and construct a single data frame from multiple data frames. Thanks.